The Duke of True Lovers. Although I might have no desire or intent at the present time to discourse of love, since all my mind is occupied with other matter the which is more pleasing to me, I am willing, for the sake of others, now to commence a wondrous story. For to this I am besought by one who, instead of making request, has the right to give command to one even more worthy than I. And this is a lord, whom it behooves one duly to obey, and who of his grace has desired me to make known the trouble which, whether he has been wise or whether he has been foolish, he has during many winters and summers long been in by reason of love, to the which his heart is still in bondage. But he would not that I should make known his name. It contents him who tells this story for their sake to be called the Duke of True Lovers. And it is his pleasure that I recount, even as he has told them unto me, the grievous distresses, the joys, and the strange adventures through the which during many bygone years he has passed. And he would that to this rehearse all should at the same time add other matter, the which I grant him, for I know him to be of such disposition, and of such good sense, that his humility will take in good part the imperfection of my little poem, and, with his consent, I will relate on his behalf the facts even as he has set them forth. I was a mere lad when I first experienced a great desire to become a lover, and for that I heard it maintained that a lover is courteous above other folk, and better esteemed amongst men, I desired to be one. To this end I resorted thither where I might choose a lady whom I might serve. But, nevertheless, I was long while without one, for on my soul I had not the understanding to make choice, and although I had enough of leisure, I nevertheless understood not how to discover the way to this. And, because of my desire, I frequented much fair company of dames and maidens, and saw many very fair damsels, but youth still kept possession of me, so that in no wise did I know how to determine whom to choose. Thus I was long while happy, content with this gay and pleasing life. But when the time dured too long for me, in this manner did I make sore plaint to love. Very God of love, who art of lovers lord, and Venus, thou love's lady and goddess, since in love only is set my happiness, vouchsafe to turn my heart soon thitherward. Vouchsafe that I be with right courage stored, soon to bring unto me my heart's mistress, very God of love, who art of lovers lord. And may I choose, if thou the grace accord, one that shall pardon me the simpleness of youth, and honor on my days impress. Out of a great desire have I implored, very God of love, who art of lovers lord. And because of the desire which I had in view, oft did I discourse thus until that true love heard me, and gratified my longing. And I will rehearse unto you in what manner love first took possession of my heart and made it captive, and never after set it free. On a day for my diversion, with one of my kinsfolk and 4 others of my gentlemen, we mounted on to our horses. A longing for the chase took possession of me, and to ensure success, I caused the huntsman to take greyhounds and ferrets. Then, without ado, we entered on a path the which I had ofttimes followed. But not far had we gone when a wide beaten track led us whither I knew there were many rabbits, and near by, I assure you, there was a strong and very goodly castle, but its name I will not make known. At that time there was come to this place a princess, who was held of everyone as so good and beautiful, and of so great worth, that she was had in honor of all. In no wise did we know that she was there, since we came thither by chance. Here and there without the castle her attendants amused themselves, some singing, some casting the weight, and others afoot exercising with the bar. And as they remained there, we turned our steps toward them. Then they all turned them toward us, and when they perceived us and recognized who we were, the chief amongst them at once rose up. And when they had saluted us, they tarried not, but, as it seemed to me, by twos and by threes, repaired them to their mistress. And methinks they did not hide from her that we were come there, for as soon as we were come quite nigh unto the castle, we saw a goodly company of ladies coming forth to meet us, and these gave us welcome with gracious bearing. And we straightway turned toward them and saluted them on bended knee. And there was amongst them both a lady and a maiden who were kinsfolk of her who was mistress of them all. And without giving affront, and without rebuke, I kissed the maiden with fair tresses as well as the lady. And my cousin and I escorted the maiden, who was high-born, and the noble lady, and in such wise entered the castle. And the lady, of whom every one spake well, had already come forth out of her chamber, and stood there with noble mien, neither proudly nor haughtily, but in such a manner as befitted her noble estate and royal person. And as soon as we saw her, we duly saluted her, and in a little space she came forward, and took me with ungloved hand, and kissed me, and said, "I knew not of your coming, fair cousin. You are right welcome. But what brings you here now?" Then said my cousin, "Certes, my lady, we set out for amusement, and knew not that you were here. Chance brought us hither, but praised be God who has so favored us that we have found at your hands so warm a welcome." And the good and gracious lady laughed at this, and made answer, "Then let us go amuse ourselves." So we descended down into a green meadow, and then, accompanying us, she went to a very fair place, and drew me to her right side to sit down beside her. And without more ado, large cushions of gold and of silk were brought to her, under the shade of a willow, where beneath the trees the waters of a spring ran fair and clear along a straight channel, fashioned and cut with skill through the green and tender herbage. And no longer did she remain standing, but she seated herself with me beside her, and then the others withdrew them to a distance from us, and sat them down here and there beside the stream. Then she began to question me, for I confess that I knew not at that time how to converse with her or with others, for I was still somewhat young. And she began her discourse by making inquiry of me concerning a journey from the which I was newly come, and in especial of the demeanor and the appearance of the ladies, and further in what manner the court, the which the king and queen held, was ordered. And I made her answer according to my knowledge. And I remember me that we discoursed together there of many things. And now it is time that I tell of how the grievous malady began, the which has made me to suffer right cruelly for love's sake. Truly it is a marvel to understand how it came to pass that love of her whom I had ofttimes seen, but whom I had never before thought on, took possession of my heart. It is like unto one who passes over the sea, exploring many lands to discover that which he might find close at hand, but the which he perceives not until another makes it known unto him. Thus in truth did it befall me, for by reason of my want of understanding, in no wise did I perceive the grace of my precious lady, until love put me in the way, and I had but desired to see such an one in order to yield my heart to her. For long had I seen her oft, but until that day no thought had I given to her. Thus I had ready to my hand that which I went elsewhere to seek. But in order to allay my passion, love at length willed to release my heart from this strife. And now when this perfect one, who has caused me sore trouble, spake to me, her speech and her gentle and gracious bearing pleased me more than ever aforetime, and made me wholly dumb. Intently did I observe her, and right well did I contemplate her beauty, since she seemed to me to be more distinguished, and to have much more of grace and sweetness than I had ever before observed. Then Love, the playful archer, who saw my silent demeanor, and that I was inclined unto love, took the arrow with the which it is his wont to surprise lovers, and bent his bow, and drew it silently. But I heeded it not. The arrow of a tender glance, the which is so pleasing and so powerful, pierced me to the heart. Then was I sore bewildered. Verily did I think myself to be lost when I felt the loving blow, but my heart yielded itself to the amorous wound. In no wise was the wound mortal, for it came to pass that the sting pierced me again and again. Then her gentle, laughing eyes, all fraught with loving fetters, so stirred my heart that I knew not how to make answer unto her. Truly must she have thought my look and my manner to be foolish, since I moved neither hand nor foot, and I so ofttimes changed color at her glance that it might have been thought that my heart trembled with fear. How shall I set the matter forth briefly? If I longed to be made captive, then in this I failed not. Thus ended the life of my early youth. How to live otherwise true love now taught me. In this manner was I made captive from that hour. Long whiles did I remain there, and I discoursed in a simple manner like unto a child, and without ceasing I kindled the burning firebrand in my heart. When I gazed on her beauty, I was caught as is the moth in the candle, or the bird in the lime, and no heed did I take of it.
The tribe of anthropoids over which Kerchak ruled with an iron hand and bared fangs numbered some 6 or 8 families, each family consisting of an adult male with his females and their young, numbering in all some 60 or 70 apes. Kayla was the youngest mate of a male called Tublat, meaning broken nose, and the child she had seen dashed to death was her first, for she was but 9 or 10 years old. Notwithstanding her youth, she was large and powerful, a splendid clean-limbed animal, with a round, high forehead which denoted more intelligence than most of her kind possessed. So, also, she had a great capacity for mother love and mother sorrow. But she was still an ape, a huge, fierce, terrible beast of a species closely allied to the gorilla, yet more intelligent, which, with the strength of their cousin, made her kind the most fearsome of those awe-inspiring progenitors of man. When the tribe saw that Kerchak's rage had ceased, they came slowly down from their arboreal retreats, and pursued again the various occupations which he had interrupted. The young played and frolicked about among the trees and bushes. Some of the adults lay prone upon the soft mat of dead and decaying vegetation which covered the ground, while others turned over pieces of fallen branches and clods of earth in search of the small bugs and reptiles which formed a part of their food. Others, again, searched the surrounding trees for fruit, nuts, small birds, and eggs. They had passed an hour or so thus when Kerchak called them together, and, with a word of command to them to follow him, set off toward the sea. They traveled for the most part upon the ground, where it was open, following the path of the great elephants whose comings and goings break the only roads through those tangled mazes of bush, vine, creeper, and tree. When they walked, it was with a rolling, awkward motion, placing the knuckles of their closed hands upon the ground and swinging their ungainly bodies forward. But when the way was through the lower trees, they moved more swiftly, swinging from branch to branch with the agility of their smaller cousins, the monkeys. And all the way, Kayla carried her little dead baby hugged closely to her breast. It was shortly after noon when they reached a ridge overlooking the beach where below them lay the tiny cottage, which was Kerchak's goal. He had seen many of his kind go to their deaths before the loud noise made by the little black stick in the hands of the strange white ape who lived in that wonderful lair, and Kerchak had made up his brute mind to own that death-dealing contrivance, and to explore the interior of the mysterious den. He wanted, very, very much, to feel his teeth sink into the neck of the queer animal that he had learned to hate and fear, and because of this, he came often with his tribe to reconnoiter, waiting for a time when the white ape should be off his guard. Of late, they had quit attacking, or even showing themselves, for every time they had done so in the past, the little stick had roared out its terrible message of death to some member of the tribe. Today there was no sign of the man about, and from where they watched, they could see that the cabin door was open. Slowly, cautiously, and noiselessly, they crept through the jungle toward the little cabin. There were no growls, no fierce screams of rage. The little black stick had taught them to come quietly, lest they awaken it. On they came, until Kerchak himself slunk stealthily to the very door and peered within. Behind him were two males, and then Kayla, closely straining the little dead form to her breast. Inside the den, they saw the strange white ape lying half across a table, his head buried in his arms, and on the bed lay a figure covered by a sailcloth, while from a tiny rustic cradle came the plaintive wailing of a babe. Noiselessly, Kerchak entered, crouching for the charge, and then John Clayton rose with a sudden start and faced them. The sight that met his eyes must have frozen him with horror, for there, within the door, stood 3 great bull apes, while behind them crowded many more. How many, he never knew, for his revolvers were hanging on the far wall beside his rifle, and Kerchak was charging. When the king ape released the limp form which had been John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, he turned his attention toward the little cradle. But Kayla was there before him, and when he would have grasped the child, she snatched it herself, and before he could intercept her, she had bolted through the door and taken refuge in a high tree. As she took up the little live baby of Alice Clayton, she dropped the dead body of her own into the empty cradle, for the wail of the living had answered the call of universal motherhood within her wild breast, which the dead could not still. High up among the branches of a mighty tree, she hugged the shrieking infant to her bosom, and soon the instinct that was as dominant in this fierce female as it had been in the breast of his tender and beautiful mother, the instinct of mother love, reached out to the tiny man-child's half-formed understanding, and he became quiet. Then hunger closed the gap between them, and the son of an English lord and an English lady nursed at the breast of Kayla, the great ape. Kayla had not once come to earth with her little adopted babe, but now Kerchak called to her to descend with the rest, and as there was no note of anger in his voice, she dropped lightly from branch to branch and joined the others on their homeward march. Those of the apes who attempted to examine Kayla's strange baby were repulsed with bared fangs and low, menacing growls, accompanied by words of warning from Kayla. When they assured her that they meant the child no harm, she permitted them to come close, but would not allow them to touch her charge. It was as though she knew that her baby was frail and delicate, and feared lest the rough hands of her fellows might injure the little thing. Another thing she did, and which made traveling an onerous trial for her. Remembering the death of her own little one, she clung desperately to the new babe with one hand whenever they were upon the march. The other young rode upon their mothers' backs, their little arms tightly clasping the hairy necks before them, while their legs were locked beneath their mother's armpits. Not so with Kayla. She held the small form of the little Lord Greystoke tightly to her breast, where the dainty hands clutched the long black hair which covered that portion of her body. She had seen one child fall from her back to a terrible death, and she would take no further chances with this. Tenderly, Kayla nursed her little waif, wondering silently why it did not gain strength and agility as did the little apes of other mothers. It was nearly a year from the time the little fellow came into her possession before he could walk alone, and as for climbing, my, but how stupid he was! Kayla sometimes talked with the other females about her young hopeful, but none of them could understand how a child could be so slow and backward in learning to care for itself. Why, it could not even find food alone, and more than 12 moons had passed since Kayla had come upon it. Had they known that the child had seen 13 moons before it had come into Kayla's possession, they would have considered its case as absolutely hopeless, for the little apes of their own tribe were as far advanced in 2 or 3 moons as was this little stranger after 25. Tublat, Kayla's husband, was sorely vexed, and but for the female's careful watching would have put the child out of the way. "He will never be a great ape," he argued. "Always will you have to carry him and protect him. What good will he be to the tribe? None, only a burden. Let us leave him quietly sleeping among the tall grasses, that you may bear other and stronger apes to guard us in our old age." "Never, Broken Nose," replied Kayla. "If I must carry him forever, so be it." And then Tublat went to Kerchak to urge him to use his authority with Kayla and force her to give up little Tarzan, which was the name they had given to the tiny Lord Greystoke, which meant white skin. But when Kerchak spoke to her about it, Kayla threatened to run away from the tribe if they did not leave her in peace with the child. And, as this is one of the inalienable rights of the jungle folk, if they be dissatisfied among their own people, they bothered her no more, for Kayla was a fine, clean-limbed young female, and they did not wish to lose her. As Tarzan grew, he made more rapid strides, so that by the time he was 10 years old, he was an excellent climber, and on the ground could do many wonderful things which were beyond the powers of his little brothers and sisters. In many ways did he differ from them, and they often marveled at his superior cunning, but in strength and size he was deficient, for at 10 the great anthropoids were fully grown, some of them towering over 6 feet in height, while little Tarzan was still but a half-grown boy. Yet such a boy! From early childhood he had used his hands to swing from branch to branch after the manner of his giant mother, and as he grew older he spent hour upon hour daily speeding through the tree-tops with his brothers and sisters. He could spring 20 feet across space at the dizzy heights of the forest top, and grasp with unerring precision, and without apparent jar, a limb waving wildly in the path of an approaching tornado. He could drop 20 feet at a stretch from limb to limb in rapid descent to the ground, or he could gain the utmost pinnacle of the loftiest tropical giant with the ease and swiftness of a squirrel. Though but 10 years old, he was fully as strong as the average man of 30, and far more agile than the most practiced athlete ever becomes, and day by day his strength was increasing. His life among these fierce apes had been happy, for his recollection held no other life, nor did he know that there existed within the universe aught else than his little forest and the wild jungle animals with which he was familiar. He was nearly 10 before he commenced to realize that a great difference existed between himself and his fellows. His little body, burned brown by exposure, suddenly caused him feelings of intense shame, for he realized that it was entirely hairless, like some low snake or other reptile. He attempted to obviate this by plastering himself from head to foot with mud, but this dried and fell off. Besides, it felt so uncomfortable that he quickly decided that he preferred the shame to the discomfort. In the higher land, which his tribe frequented, was a little lake, and it was here that Tarzan first saw his face in the clear, still waters of its bosom. It was on a sultry day of the dry season that he and one of his cousins had gone down to the bank to drink. As they leaned over, both little faces were mirrored on the placid pool, the fierce and terrible features of the ape beside those of the aristocratic scion of an old English house. Tarzan was appalled. It had been bad enough to be hairless, but to own such a countenance! He wondered that the other apes could look at him at all. That tiny slit of a mouth, and those puny white teeth! How they looked beside the mighty lips and powerful fangs of his more fortunate brothers! And the little pinched nose of his, so thin was it that it looked half-starved. He turned red as he compared it with the beautiful broad nostrils of his companion. Such a generous nose! Why, it spread half across his face! It certainly must be fine to be so handsome, thought poor little Tarzan. But when he saw his own eyes, that was the final blow. A brown spot, a gray circle, and then blank whiteness. Frightful! Not even the snakes had such hideous eyes as he.
The house was very still. In the little room over the porch, the lady in black sat alone. Near her, a child's white dress lay across a chair. On the floor at her feet lay a tiny pair of shoes. A doll hung over a chair, and a toy soldier occupied the little stand by the bed. And everywhere was silence. The strange silence that comes only to a room where the clock has stopped ticking. The clock stood on the shelf near the end of the bed. The lady in black looked at it. She remembered the wave of anger that had come over her when she had reached out her hand and silenced the clock that night 3 months before. It had been silent ever since, and it should remain silent, too. Of what possible use were the hours it would tick away now? As if anything mattered, with little Kathleen lying out there white and still under the black earth. "Mother!" The lady in black moved restlessly and looked toward the closed door. Behind it, she knew, was a little boy with wide blue eyes who wanted her. But she wished he would not call her by that name. It only reminded her of those other little lips, silent now. "Mother!" The voice was more demanding. The lady in black did not answer. He might go away, she thought, if she did not answer. There was a short silence, and then the door opened slowly. "Peek!" It was a cry of joyful discovery, but it was followed almost immediately by silence. The unsmiling woman did not invite him to come near. The boy was unsteady at his first step. He paused, then spoke carefully. "I's here?" It was maybe the worst thing he could have said. To the lady in black, it was a yet more painful reminder of that other one who was not there. She gave a sharp cry and covered her face with her hands. "Bobby! Bobby!" she cried out in a release of unreasoning sadness. "Go away! Go away! I want to be alone! Alone!" All the brightness fled from the boy's face. His eyes showed a feeling of deep hurt. He waited, but she did not move. Then, with a half-quieted cry, he left the room. Long minutes afterward, the lady in black raised her head and saw him through the window. He was in the yard with his father, playing under the apple tree. Playing! The lady in black looked at them with serious eyes, and her mouth hardened at the corners. Bobby had someone to play with him, someone to love him and care for him, while out there on the hillside, Kathleen was alone, all alone. With a little cry, the lady in black sprang to her feet and hurried into her own room. Her hands shook as she pinned on her hat and covered herself with her black veil. But her step was firm as she walked downstairs and out through the hall. The man under the apple tree rose hurriedly and came forward. "Helen, dearest, not again today," he begged. "Darling, it can't do any good." "But she's alone, all alone. You don't seem to think. No one thinks. No one knows how I feel. You don't understand. If you did, you'd come with me. You wouldn't ask me to stay here," choked the woman. "I have been with you, dear," said the man gently. "I've been with you today and every day, almost since she left us. But it can't do any good, this continuous mourning over her grave. It only makes more sadness for you, for me, and for Bobby. Bobby is here, you know, dear." No, don't say it," cried the woman wildly. "You don't understand. You don't understand." And she turned and hurried away, followed by the worried eyes of the man and the sad eyes of the boy. It was not a long walk to the burial place. The lady in black knew the way, yet she stumbled and reached out blindly. She fell before a little stone marked Kathleen. Near her, a gray-haired woman, with her hands full of pink and white roses, watched her sympathetically. The gray-haired woman paused and opened her lips as if she would speak. Then she turned slowly and began to arrange her flowers on a grave nearby. The lady in black raised her head. For a time she watched in silence. Then she threw back her veil and spoke. "You care too," she said softly. "You understand. I've seen you here before, I'm sure. And was yours a little girl?" The gray-haired woman shook her head. "No, dearie, it's a little boy. Or he was a little boy 40 years ago." 40 years? So long! How could you have lived 40 years without him? Again the little woman shook her head. "One has to, sometimes, dearie. But this little boy wasn't mine." "But you care. You understand. I've seen you here so often before." "Yes. You see, there's no one else to care. But there was once, and I'm caring now for her sake." "For her?" "His mother." "Oh." It was a tender little cry, full of quick sympathy. The eyes of the lady in black were on the stone marked Kathleen. "It ain't as if I didn't know how she'd feel," said the gray-haired woman. "You see, I was nurse to the boy when it happened, and for years afterward I worked in the family, so I know. I saw the whole thing from the beginning, from the very day when the little boy here met with the accident." "Accident?" It was a cry of concern and sympathy from Kathleen's mother. "Yes, it was a runaway, and he didn't live 2 days." I know," choked the lady in black. Yet she was not thinking of the boy and the runaway horse accident. "Things stopped then for my mistress, and that was the beginning of the end. She had a husband and a daughter, but they didn't seem to be important, not either of 'em. Nothing seemed important except this little grave out here. She came and spent hours over it, bringing flowers and talking to it." The lady in black raised her head suddenly and quickly looked into the woman's face. The woman went on speaking. "The house got sadder and sadder. She didn't seem to mind. She seemed to want it so. She shut out the sunshine and put away many of the pictures. She sat only in the boy's room, and there everything was just as it was when he left it. She wouldn't let a thing be touched. I wondered afterward that she didn't see where it was all leading to, but she didn't." "Leading to?" The voice shook. "Yeah, I wondered she didn't see she was losing 'em, that husband and daughter, but she didn't see it." The lady in black sat very still. Even the birds seemed to have stopped their singing. Then the gray-haired woman spoke. "So, you see, that's why I come and put flowers here. It's for her. There's no one else now to care," she sighed, rising to her feet. "But you haven't told yet what happened," said the lady in black softly. "Oh, I don't know myself, really. I know the man went away. He got something to do traveling, so he wasn't home much. When he did come, he looked sick and bad. He come less and less, and he died. But that was after she died. He's buried over there beside her and the boy. The girl, well, nobody knows where the girl is. Girls like flowers and sunshine and laughter and young people, you know. And she didn't get any of them at home. So she went where she did get 'em, I suppose. There, and if I haven't gone and tired you all out with my talking," said the little gray-haired woman regretfully. No, I was glad to hear it," said the lady in black, rising unsteadily to her feet. Her face had grown white, and her eyes showed a sudden fear. "But I must go now. Thank you." And she turned and hurried away. The house was very still when the lady in black reached home. She shivered at its silence. She hurried up the stairs, almost with guilt. In her own room, she pulled at the dark veil that covered her face. She was crying now, a choking little cry with broken words running through it. She was still crying as she removed her black dress. Long minutes later, the lady, in black no longer, moved slowly down the stairway. Her eyes showed traces of tears, but her lips were bravely curved in a smile. She wore a white dress and a single white rose in her hair. Behind her, in the little room over the porch, a tiny clock ticked loudly on its shelf near the end of the bed. There came a sound of running feet in the hall below. Then, "Mother! It's Mother! Come back!" shouted a happy voice. And with a little sobbing cry, Bobby's mother opened her arms to her son.
It was a dark autumn night. The old banker was pacing from corner to corner of his study, recalling to his mind the party he gave in the autumn 15 years before. There were many clever people at the party, and much interesting conversation. They talked, among other things, of capital punishment. The guests, among them not a few scholars and journalists, for the most part disapproved of capital punishment. They found it obsolete as a means of punishment, unfitted to a Christian state, and immoral. Some of them thought that capital punishment should be replaced universally by life imprisonment. "I don't agree with you," said the host. "I myself have experienced neither capital punishment nor life imprisonment, but if one may judge a priori, then, in my opinion, capital punishment is more moral and more humane than imprisonment. Execution kills instantly. Life imprisonment kills by degrees. Who is the more humane executioner? One who kills you in a few seconds, or one who draws the life out of you incessantly for years?" "They're both equally immoral," remarked one of the guests, "because their purpose is the same, to take away life. The state is not God. It has no right to take away that which it cannot give back, if it should so desire." Among the company was a lawyer, a young man of about 25. On being asked his opinion, he said, "Capital punishment and life imprisonment are equally immoral, but if I were offered the choice between them, I would certainly choose the second. It is better to live somehow than not to live at all." There ensued a lively discussion. The banker, who was then younger and more nervous, suddenly lost his temper, banged his fist on the table, and turning to the young lawyer, cried out, "It's a lie. I bet you 2 millions you wouldn't stick in a cell even for 5 years." "If you mean it seriously," replied the lawyer, "then I bet I'll stay not 5, but 15. 15, done," cried the banker. "Gentlemen, I stake 2 millions. "Agreed. You stake 2 millions, I my freedom," said the lawyer. So this wild, ridiculous bet came to pass. The banker, who at that time had too many millions to count, spoiled and capricious, was beside himself with rapture. During supper he said to the lawyer jokingly, "Come to your senses, young roan, before it's too late. 2 millions are nothing to me, but you stand to lose 3 or 4 of the best years of your life. I say 3 or 4 because you'll never stick it out any longer. Don't forget either, you unhappy man, that voluntary is much heavier than enforced imprisonment. The idea that you have the right to free yourself at any moment will poison the whole of your life in the cell. I pity you." And now the banker, pacing from corner to corner, recalled all this and asked himself, "Why did I make this bet? What's the good? The lawyer loses 15 years of his life, and I throw away 2 millions. Will it convince people that capital punishment is worse or better than imprisonment for life? No, all stuff and rubbish. On my part, it was the caprice of a well-fed man. On the lawyer's, pure greed of gold." He recollected further what happened after the evening party. It was decided that the lawyer must undergo his imprisonment under the strictest observation, in a garden wing of the banker's house. It was agreed that during the period he would be deprived of the right to cross the threshold, to see living people, to hear human voices, and to receive letters and newspapers. He was permitted to have a musical instrument, to read books, to write letters, to drink wine and smoke tobacco. By the agreement, he could communicate, but only in silence, with the outside world, through a little window specially constructed for this purpose. Everything necessary, books, music, wine, he could receive in any quantity by sending a note through the window. The agreement provided for all the minutest details, which made the confinement strictly solitary, and it obliged the lawyer to remain exactly 15 years, from 12 o'clock of November 14, 1870, to 12 o'clock of November 14, 1885. The least attempt on his part to violate the conditions, to escape, if only for 2 minutes, before the time, freed the banker from the obligation to pay him the $2 million. During the first year of imprisonment, the lawyer, as far as it was possible to judge from his short notes, suffered terribly from loneliness and boredom. From his wing, day and night, came the sound of the piano. He rejected wine and tobacco. Wine, he wrote, excites desires, and desires are the chief foes of a prisoner. Besides, nothing is more boring than to drink good wine alone. And tobacco spoils the air in his room. During the first year, the lawyer was sent books of a light character, novels with a complicated love interest, stories of crime and fantasy, comedies, and so on. In the second year, the piano was heard no longer, and the lawyer asked only for classics. In the fifth year, music was heard again, and the prisoner asked for wine. Those who watched him said that during the whole of that year, he was only eating, drinking, and lying on his bed. He yawned often and talked angrily to himself. Books he did not read. Sometimes at nights he would sit down to write. He would write for a long time and tear it all up in the morning. More than once he was heard to weep. In the second half of the sixth year, the prisoner began zealously to study languages, philosophy, and history. He fell on these subjects so hungrily that the banker hardly had time to get books enough for him. In the space of 4 years, about 600 volumes were bought at his request. It was while that passion lasted that the banker received the following letter from the prisoner. My dear jailer, I am writing these lines in 6 languages. Show them to experts. Let them read them. If they do not find one single mistake, I beg you to give orders to have a gun fired off in the garden. By the noise, I shall know that my efforts have not been in vain. The geniuses of all ages and countries speak in different languages, but in them all burns the same flame. Oh, if you knew my heavenly happiness, now that I can understand them. The prisoner's desire was fulfilled. 2 shots were fired in the garden by the banker's order. Later on, after the 10th year, the lawyer sat immovable before his table and read only the New Testament. The banker found it strange that a man who in 4 years had mastered 600 erudite volumes should have spent nearly a year in reading one book, easy to understand and by no means thick. The New Testament was then replaced by the history of religions and theology. During the last 2 years of his confinement, the prisoner read an extraordinary amount, quite haphazard. Now he would apply himself to the natural sciences. Then he would read Byron or Shakespeare. Notes used to come from him in which he asked to be sent at the same time a book on chemistry, a textbook of medicine, a novel, and some treatise on philosophy or theology. He read as though he were swimming in the sea among broken pieces of wreckage, and in his desire to save his life was eagerly grasping one piece after another. The banker recalled all this, and thought, tomorrow at 12 o'clock he receives his freedom. Under the agreement, I shall have to pay him $2 million. If I pay, it's all over with me. I am ruined forever. 15 years before, he had too many millions to count, but now he was afraid to ask himself which he had more of, money or debts, gambling on the stock exchange, risky speculation, and the recklessness of which he could not rid himself, even in old age, had gradually brought his business to decay, and the fearless, self-confident, proud man of business had become an ordinary banker, trembling at every rise and fall in the market. "That cursed bet," murmured the old man, clutching his head in despair. "Why didn't the man die? He's only 40 years old. He will take away my last farthing, marry, enjoy life, gamble on the exchange, and I will look on like an envious beggar and hear the same words from him every day. I'm obliged to you for the happiness of my life. Let me help you." "No, it's too much. The only escape from bankruptcy and disgrace is that the man should die." The clock had just struck 3. The banker was listening. In the house, everyone was asleep, and one could hear only the frozen trees whining outside the windows. Trying to make no sound, he took out of his safe the key of the door which had not been opened for 15 years, put on his overcoat, and went out of the house. The garden was dark and cold. It was raining. A damp, penetrating wind howled in the garden and gave the trees no rest. Though he strained his eyes, the banker could see neither the ground nor the white statues, nor the garden wing, nor the trees. Approaching the garden wing, he called the watchman twice. There was no answer. Evidently, the watchman had taken shelter from the bad weather and was now asleep somewhere in the kitchen or the greenhouse. "If I have the courage to fulfill my intention," thought the old man, "the suspicion will fall on the watchman first of all." In the darkness he groped for the steps and the door, and entered the hall of the garden wing, then poked his way into a narrow passage and struck a match. Not a soul was there. Someone's bed, with no bedclothes on it, stood there, and an iron stove loomed dark in the corner. The seals on the door that led into the prisoner's room were unbroken. When the match went out, the old man, trembling from agitation, peeped into the little window. In the prisoner's room, a candle was burning dimly. The prisoner himself sat by the table. Only his back, the hair on his head, and his hands were visible. Open books were strewn about on the table, the 2 chairs, and on the carpet near the table. 5 minutes passed, and the prisoner never once stirred. 15 years' confinement had taught him to sit motionless. The banker tapped on the window with his finger, but the prisoner made no movement in reply. Then the banker cautiously tore the seals from the door and put the key into the lock. The rusty lock gave a hoarse groan, and the door creaked. The banker expected instantly to hear a cry of surprise and the sound of steps. 3 minutes passed, and it was as quiet inside as it had been before. He made up his mind to enter. Before the table sat a man, unlike an ordinary human being. It was a skeleton, with tight-drawn skin, with long curly hair like a woman's, and a shaggy beard. The color of his face was yellow, of an earthy shade. The cheeks were sunken, the back long and narrow, and the hand upon which he leaned his hairy head was so lean and skinny that it was painful to look upon. His hair was already silvering with gray, and no one who glanced at the senile emaciation of the face would have believed that he was only 40 years old. On the table before his bended head lay a sheet of paper on which something was written in a tiny hand. "Poor devil," thought the banker. "He's asleep and probably seeing millions in his dreams. I have only to take and throw this half-dead thing on the bed, smother him a moment with the pillow, and the most careful examination will find no trace of unnatural death. But first, let us read what he has written here." The banker took the sheet from the table and read, "Tomorrow at 12 o'clock midnight, I shall obtain my freedom and the right to mix with people. But before I leave this room and see the sun, I think it necessary to say a few words to you. On my own clear conscience, and before God who sees me, I declare to you that I despise freedom, life, health, and all that your books call the blessings of the world. For 15 years I have diligently studied earthly life. True, I saw neither the earth nor the people, but in your books I drank fragrant wine, sang songs, hunted deer and wild boar in the forests, loved women. And beautiful women, like clouds ethereal, created by the magic of your poet's genius, visited me by night, and whispered to me wonderful tales, which made my head drunken. In your books I climbed the summits of Elbrus and Mont Blanc, and saw from there how the sun rose in the morning, and in the evening suffused the sky, the ocean, and lie mountain ridges with a purple gold. I saw from there how above me lightnings glimmered, cleaving the clouds. I saw green forests, fields, rivers, lakes, cities. I heard sirens singing, and the playing of the pipes of Pan. I touched the wings of beautiful devils, who came flying to me to speak of God. In your books I cast myself into bottomless abysses, worked miracles, burned cities to the ground, preached new religions, conquered whole countries. Your books gave me wisdom. All that unwearying human thought created in the centuries is compressed to a little lump in my skull. I know that I am cleverer than you all. And I despise your books, despise all worldly blessings and wisdom. Everything is void, frail, visionary, and delusive as a mirage. Though you be proud and wise and beautiful, yet will death wipe you from the face of the earth like the mice underground. And your posterity, your history, and the immortality of your men of genius will be as frozen slag, burnt down together with the terrestrial globe. You are mad and gone the wrong way. You take falsehood for truth and ugliness for beauty. You would marvel if suddenly apple and orange trees should bear frogs and lizards instead of fruit, and if roses should begin to breathe the odor of a sweating horse. So do I marvel at you, who have bartered heaven for earth. I do not want to understand you. That I may show you indeed my contempt for that by which you live, I waive the 2 millions, of which I once dreamed as of paradise, and which I now despise. That I may deprive myself of my right to them, I shall come out from here 5 minutes before the stipulated term, and thus shall violate the agreement." When he had read, the banker put the sheet on the table, kissed the head of the strange man, and began to weep. He went out of the wing. Never at any other time, not even after his terrible losses on the exchange, had he felt such contempt for himself as now. Coming home, he lay down on his bed, but agitation and tears kept him a long time from sleeping. The next morning, the poor watchman came running to him and told him that they had seen the man who lived in the wing climb through the window into the garden. He had gone to the gate and disappeared. The banker instantly went with his servants to the wing and established the escape of his prisoner. To avoid unnecessary rumors, he took the paper with the renunciation from the table and, on his return, locked it in his safe.
with cold, pale clouds high up in the sky. Towards evening, some thin brass-yellow stripes appeared on the western horizon. Jenny had been up to Monticello to sketch in the afternoon, but it did not come to much. She had been sitting listlessly on the big stairs outside of San Gregorio, looking down into the grove where the big trees were beginning to bud, and daisies shone all over the grass. She came back through the avenue below the south side of the Palatine. The ruins showed dull gray against the palms of the convent on the mountain-top. The evergreen shrubs hung on the slope, powdered with chalky dust. Some shivering postcard sellers loitered about outside the Constantine Arch on the piazza, where the ruins of the Colosseum, the Palatine, and the Forum lay. Very few tourists were about. A couple of skinny old ladies bargained in vile Italian with a mosaic peddler. A small boy of barely 3 hung on to Jenny's cloak, offering her a small wisp of pansies. He was exquisitely black-eyed and long-haired, and dressed in national costume, with pointed hat, velvet jacket, and sandals over white woolen socks. He could not speak distinctly yet, but he could manage to ask for a soldo. Jenny gave him the coin, and instantly the mother came up to his side, thanking her and taking the money herself. She, too, had tried to give her dress a national touch by lacing a red velvet bodice on top of her dirty checked blouse and pinning on top of her hair a serviette folded into a square. She carried an infant in her arms. It was 3 weeks old, she said, in answer to Jenny's question. Yes, the poor dear was ill. The infant was no bigger than Jenny's own boy had been at birth. Its skin was red and sore and peeling. It was panting, as if its throat were choked by mucus, and the eyes looked wearily from under inflamed, half-closed lids. "Oh, yes, she took it every day to the hospital for treatment," said the mother, "but they said there that it was going to die. Best thing for it, too. The woman was looking so tired and sad, besides being ugly and toothless." Jenny felt the tears mounting to her eyes. Poor little creature. It certainly was much better for it to die. She passed her hand caressingly over the little ugly face. She had given the woman some money and was on the point of going when a man suddenly passed her. He took off his hat and stopped for a moment, but walked on as Jenny did not acknowledge his salute. It was Helga Graham. She was too much taken aback to think of answering. She bent down to the little boy with the pansies, taking his hands and pulling him closer to her, and talked to him, trying to master the unreasonable shivering of her whole body. She turned her head once in the direction he had gone, and saw him standing on the stairs that led to the street from the piazza round the Colosseum, and looking in her direction. She remained in the same position, talking to the child and the woman. When she looked up again, he was gone, but she waited long after she had seen his gray coat and hat disappear round a corner. Then she went home, almost running through side streets and passages, afraid of meeting him every time she turned a corner. She got as far as the other side of the Pincio, and went to have some food in a trattoria where she had never been before. Then, after a rest and some wine, she began to feel better. If she met Helga and he spoke to her, it would be very painful. She would much prefer to escape it, but if it happened, it was nothing to be so senselessly afraid of. Everything between them was finished. What had occurred after their separation was no concern of his, and he had no right to take her to task for anything. Whatever he knew about it, and whatever he had to say, she had said it all to herself, for nobody knew better than she what she had done. She had to answer only to herself. Nothing else could compare with that ordeal. Need she fear anybody? Nobody could do her a greater wrong than she had done to herself. It had been a bad day, one of those days when she did not feel sober. However, she felt better now. Scarcely was she out in the street before the same stupid, desperate fright came over her again. And without realizing it, she rushed on as if lashed by it, with clenched hands and muttering to herself. Once she pulled off her gloves because she was burning hot, and she recollected suddenly having noticed a wet spot on one of them after she had caressed the child. She flung them away in disgust. When she reached home, she stood a moment hesitating in the passage, then knocked at Gunnar's door, but he was not in. She went to look on the roof. There was no one there. She entered her room, lit the lamp, and sat staring at the flame, her arms folded. After a while she rose and began walking restlessly up and down the floor, only to sit down again as before. She listened breathlessly to every sound on the stairs. Oh, if only Gunnar would come, and not the other one. But how could he? He did not know where she lived. He might have met somebody who knew and asked, "Oh, Gunnar, Gunnar, come!" She would go straight to him, throw herself in his arms. The moment she had seen Helga Graham's light brown eyes again, her whole past, that had been under their glance, confronted her. It all came back, the disgust, the doubt of her own ability to feel, to will, and to choose, and the suspicion that in reality she wanted what she said she did not. While she was pretending to herself that she wanted to be strong, pure, and whole in her feelings, and while she said she wanted to be honest, courageous, disciplined, to work and to sacrifice herself for others, she allowed herself to be tossed between moods and desires she did not care to fight, although she knew she should have done so. She had pretended to love so as to sneak into a place in life which she could never have attained if she had been honest. She had wanted to change her nature, to fall in with the others who lived, although she knew she would always be a stranger among them because she was of a different kind. She had not been able to stand alone, a prisoner, so to say, of her own nature, and her relations to those who were strange to her innermost being, the son and the father, had been unnatural and repulsive. In consequence of it, her own inner self was ruined. Every fixed point in herself, to which she had held on, gave way, crumbled to nothing. She felt as if she were dissolving from within. If Helga came, if she met him, she knew that the despair and disgust of her own life would overwhelm her. She did not know what would happen, but one thing was certain. She could not face a repetition of the old scenes. And Gunnar. All these weeks, while he had been begging of her to be his, she had not made up her mind if she loved him or not. He wanted her such as she was, and he vowed that he could help her, build up again all that had been destroyed in her. Sometimes she wished that he would take her by force, so that she need not choose. It did not matter what he said. She knew that if she became his, the little pride she had left told her that the responsibility was her own. She had to become what she had once been, what he believed she had been and could be again. Whether she cared or not, she had to clean herself from all that soiled her now, bury in a new life everything that had happened since she gave Helga Graham the kiss by which she betrayed her faith and her whole life up to that spring day on the Campagna. Did she want to be his? Did she love him because he was all that she had wished to be, because his whole being awoke in her all that which she had once chosen to worship and to nurse, every faculty she had thought worth developing? The love she had looked for on byways, driven by her morbid longing and feverish restlessness, would she find it here by surrendering to him, by shutting her eyes and giving herself to the one man she really trusted, the one who all her instincts told her was her conscience and her just judge? She had not been able to do it, not in all these weeks. It seemed to her that she ought to try and get out by her own will from the mire into which she had descended. She wanted to feel that it was her will from the old days which had taken the lead of her shattered mind, so that she could get back ever so little of the respect and confidence in herself from before. If she was going to go on living, Gunnar was life itself to her. A few words written by him on a piece of paper, a book that brought her a message from some emotion in his soul, had awakened the last smoldering longing back to life, when, after the death of the child, she had dragged herself about like a maimed animal. If he came now, he would win her. If he would but carry her the first bit of the way, she would try to walk the rest of it herself. and as she sat there waiting for him, she decided in her shrinking soul, if he comes, I shall live. If the other one comes, I must die. And when she heard the steps on the stairs, and they were not those of Gunnar, and there was a knock at the door, she bent her head and went shivering to open it for Helga Graham, instinctively feeling that she opened the door to the fate she had challenged. She stood looking at him while he walked into the room, putting his hat on a chair. She had not acknowledged his greeting this time either.
"I knew you were in town," said he. "I came the day before yesterday from Paris. I looked up your address at the club and meant to come and see you some day, but then I saw you in the street this afternoon. I recognized your gray fur a long way off."
He spoke swiftly, out of breath as it were.
"Will you not say good evening to me? Are you vexed because I have come to see you?"
"Good evening, Helga," she said, taking the hand he offered her. "Will you not sit down, please?" She sat down on the sofa. She could hear that her voice sounded calm and as usual, but in her brain she had the same delirious sensation of dread as in the afternoon.
"I wanted to come see you,"
said Helga, sitting down on a chair close to her. "It was good of you," replied Jenny. Both were silent. "You live in Bergen now," she said. "I saw that you had got your degree. I congratulate you."
"Thank you."
There was another pause.
"You have been abroad a long time. I meant to write to you sometimes, but it never came off. Hagen lives in this house, I see."
"Yes. I wrote him to get a studio for me, but they are so dear and so difficult to find. This room has a good light, though."
"I see that you have some pictures drying."
He rose, went across the room, but returned immediately to his seat. Jenny bent her head, feeling that he did not take his eyes from her. They tried to keep up conversation. He asked about Francesca Allen and other acquaintances they had in common, but there were long intervals when he sat staring at her.
"Do you know that my parents are divorced?" he asked suddenly.
She nodded.
"They stayed together for our sake as long as they could, whining and creaking against each other like two millstones until they had ground everything to powder between them. There was nothing more to grind, I suppose, so the mill stopped. I remember when I was a boy, they did not fight, but there was something in their voices that made you think they would like to. Mother abused him and used plain talk, always ending with tears. Father kept cool and quiet, but his voice was full of hatred and so hard and cutting. I lay in my bed listening to this performance that was forced on me. I used to think what a relief it would be to put a knitting needle right through my head, in at one ear and out at the other. The voices created a physical pain in my ears and spread to the whole of my head. Well, that was the beginning. They have done their duty as parents, and now it is all over. Hatred is an ugly thing. It makes everything ugly that comes in contact with it. I went to see my sister last summer. We have never been sympathetic, but I thought it disgusting to see her with that husband of hers. Sometimes I saw him kiss her, taking his pipe out of his thick, wet mouth. He kissed his wife. I saw Sophie get quite white when he touched her. He is a pope in his pulpit and a libertine at home. As to you and me, it was quite natural. I understood it afterwards, that the fine, delicate threads between us should break, that they could not stand the atmosphere at home. When I had gone from you that time, I regretted it, and meant to write to you, but do you know why I did not? I had a letter from my father, telling me he had been to see you, and that he thought I ought to resume my relations with you. I have a superstitious objection to any advice from that quarter, so I did not write. All the time since we parted, I have been longing for you, Jenny, dreaming of you, and recalling again and again to my memory the time I spent here with you. Do you know which place in Rome I revisited first of all, yesterday? I went to Montagnola, and found our names on the cactus leaf.
Jenny was sitting with clenched hands, very pale.
You look exactly the same as then, and you have lived 3 years about which I don't know anything," said Helga gently. "I can scarcely realize that I am here with you again. It seems as if all that has happened since we parted here in Rome were not true. Yet you belong perhaps to somebody else now."
Jenny did not answer.
"Are you engaged?" he asked quietly.
"No."
"Jenny."
Helga bent his head so that she could not see his face.
"All these years I have been hoping, dreaming of winning you back. I have imagined that we should meet again some day and come to an understanding. You said I was the first man you had been fond of. Is my dream impossible?"
"Yes," she said.
"Hagen?"
She did not answer at once.
"I have always been jealous of Hagen," said Helga gently. "I thought he was the one, especially when I saw that you both lived here. So, you are in love with each other?"
Jenny still did not answer.
"Do you love him?"
"Yes, but I will not marry him."
"Oh, I see," said Helga in a hard voice.
"No." She bent her head, tired, smiling sadly. "I have done with love. I don't want to have anything more to do with it. I am tired, and I wish you would go, Helga."
But he did not move. "I cannot realize now, when I see you again, that it is all over. I never would believe it. I have been thinking so much of it. I suppose it was my own fault. I was so timid. I never knew what was the right thing to do. Everything might have been quite different. I have often remembered the last evening I was with you in Rome, and it seemed always that such an occasion would present itself again, for I left you then because I thought it was right. Surely that could not have been the cause of my losing you. I had never been near a woman then," he said, looking down. "I was warned by what I had seen at home. Dreams and fancies became a hell at times, but the fear was always paramount. I am 29, and there has been no beautiful or happy experience in my life but that short spring spent with you. Can you not understand that I have never been able to separate you from my thoughts, that I love you as before? The only happiness I have known is that you gave me. I cannot let you go out of my life, not now."
She got up, trembling, and he rose too. Instinctively she drew back a few steps from him. "Helga, there has been another." He stood still, looking at her.
"You say there has been another, and it could have been. I don't care. I want you all the same. I want you now because you promised me once to be mine."
Terrified, she tried to go past him, but he seized her violently in his arms. It took a few seconds for her brain to realize that he was kissing her mouth. She thought she made a resistance, but was in fact almost passive in his arms. She wanted to tell him not to, and she wanted to say who the other had been, but she could not. She would have told him about the child, but when she remembered the boy, she shrank from mentioning him. She felt she must not drag her child into the disaster she knew was coming. As this thought crossed her mind, she imagined she felt the dead little one caressing her, and it gave her a sensation of joy, so that her body relaxed for a second in his arms.
"You are mine. Mine only. Yes, yes, Jenny."
She tore herself away from him, and running to the door, she called aloud for Gunnar. Helga was at her side again in an instant, taking her back in his arms. They wrestled with each other by the door without a word. It seemed to Jenny that her life depended on her opening it and escaping into Gunnar's room. But feeling Helga close to her, stronger than she, as he held her, it seemed to her that there was no escape, and at last she gave way. In the gray morning light, he came over to her to kiss her.
"My glorious Jenny, how wonderfully beautiful you are. You are mine now, and everything will come right, will it not? Oh, I love you so. Are you tired? You must sleep when I have gone, and I will come to see you again at noon. Sleep soundly, my darling Jenny. Are you so tired?"
Yes, very tired, Helga. She was lying with her eyes half closed, looking at the pale morning light coming through the ribs of the blind. He kissed her when he stood fully dressed, holding his hat. Then he kneeled by her bed and put an arm under her shoulder.
Thank you for tonight. Do you remember that I said those same words to you the first morning in Rome, when we were at the Aventine?
Jenny nodded on her pillow.
One more kiss, and good night, my lovely Jenny.
At the door he stopped.
What about the front door? Is there a key, or is it one of those ordinary ones with a latch?
Yes, an ordinary one. You can open it all right from the inside. She remained in bed with her eyes closed. She saw her own body as it lay under the cover, white, bare, beautiful, a thing that she had flung away as she had the gloves. It was not hers any more.
The ship with so much regret entered this house. She had scarcely closed the door after her when Monte Cristo appeared at the corner of a street, so that he found and lost her again almost at the same instant. The worn-out steps were old acquaintances of his. He knew better than anyone else how to open that weather-beaten door with the large-headed nail which served to raise the latch within. He entered without knocking or giving any other intimation of his presence, as if he had been a friend or the master of the place. At the end of a passage paved with bricks was a little garden, bathed in sunshine and rich in warmth and light. In this garden Mercedes had found, at the place indicated by the Count, the sum of money which he, through a sense of delicacy, had described as having been placed there 24 years previously. The trees of the garden were easily seen from the steps of the street door. Monte Cristo, on stepping into the house, heard a sigh that was almost a deep sob. He looked in the direction whence it came, and there, under an arbor of Virginia jessamine, with its thick foliage and beautiful long purple flowers, he saw Mercedes seated, with her head bowed and weeping bitterly. She had raised her veil and, with her face hidden by her hands, was giving free scope to the sighs and tears which had been so long restrained by the presence of her son. Monte Cristo advanced a few steps, which were heard on the gravel. Mercedes raised her head and uttered a cry of terror on beholding a man before her. "Madame," said the Count, "it is no longer in my power to restore you to happiness, but I offer you consolation. Will you deign to accept it as coming from a friend?" "I am indeed most wretched," replied Mercedes. "Alone in the world I had but my son, and he has left me." "He possesses a noble heart, madame," replied the Count, "and he has acted rightly. He feels that every man owes a tribute to his country. Some contribute their talents, others their industry. These devote their blood, those their nightly labors, to the same cause. Had he remained with you, his life must have become a hateful burden, nor would he have participated in your griefs. He will increase in strength and honor by struggling with adversity, which he will convert into prosperity. Leave him to build up the future for you, and I venture to say you will confide it to safe hands." "Oh," replied the wretched woman, mournfully shaking her head, "the prosperity of which you speak, and which, from the bottom of my heart, I pray God in his mercy to grant him, I can never enjoy. The bitter cup of adversity has been drained by me to the very dregs, and I feel that the grave is not far distant. You have acted kindly, Count, in bringing me back to the place where I have enjoyed so much bliss. I ought to meet death on the same spot where happiness was once all my own." "Alas," said Monte Cristo, "your words sear and embitter my heart, the more so as you have every reason to hate me. I have been the cause of all your misfortunes. But why do you pity instead of blaming me? You render me still more unhappy." "Hate you? Blame you? Edmund? Hate, Reproach the man that has spared my son's life? For was it not your fatal and sanguinary intention to destroy that son of whom Monsieur de Morcerf was so proud? Oh, look at me closely, and discover, if you can, even the semblance of a reproach in me." The Count looked up and fixed his eyes on Mercedes, who arose partly from her seat and extended both her hands towards him. "Oh, look at me," continued she with a feeling of profound melancholy. "My eyes no longer dazzle by their brilliancy, for the time has long fled since I used to smile on Edmond Dantes, who anxiously looked out for me from the window of yonder garret, then inhabited by his old father. Years of grief have created an abyss between those days and the present. I neither reproach you nor hate you, my friend. Oh no, Edmund, it is myself that I blame, myself that I hate. Oh, miserable creature that I am!" cried she, clasping her hands and raising her eyes to heaven. "I once possessed piety, innocence, and love, the three ingredients of the happiness of angels. And now, what am I?" Monte Cristo approached her and silently took her hand. "No," said she, withdrawing it gently. "No, my friend, touch me not. You have spared me, yet of all those who have fallen under your vengeance, I was the most guilty. They were influenced by hatred, by avarice, and by self-love. But I was base, and for want of courage acted against my judgment. Nay, do not press my hand, Edmund. You are thinking, I am sure, of some kind speech to console me, but do not utter it to me. Reserve it for others more worthy of your kindness. See," and she exposed her face completely to view, "see, misfortune has silvered my hair. My eyes have shed so many tears that they are encircled by a rim of purple, and my brow is wrinkled. You, Edmund, on the contrary, you are still young, handsome, dignified. It is because you have had faith, because you have had strength, because you have had trust in God, and God has sustained you. But as for me, I have been a coward. I have denied God, and he has abandoned me." Mercedes burst into tears. Her woman's heart was breaking under its load of memories. Monte Cristo took her hand and imprinted a kiss on it, but she herself felt that it was a kiss of no greater warmth than he would have bestowed on the hand of some marble statue of a saint. "It often happens," continued she, "that a first fault destroys the prospects of a whole life. I believed you dead. Why did I survive you? What good has it done me to mourn for you eternally in the secret recesses of my heart, only to make a woman of 39 look like a woman of 50? Why, having recognized you, and I the only one to do so, why was I able to save my son alone? Ought I not also to have rescued the man that I had accepted for a husband, guilty though he were? Yet I let him die. What do I say? O merciful heavens, was I not accessory to his death by my supine insensibility, by my contempt for him, not remembering or not willing to remember that it was for my sake he had become a traitor and a perjurer? In what am I benefited by accompanying my son so far, since I now abandon him, and allow him to depart alone to the baneful climate of Africa? Oh, I have been base, cowardly, I tell you. I have abjured my affections, and, like all renegades, I am of evil omen to those who surround me." "No, Mercedes," said Monte Cristo. "No! You judge yourself with too much severity. You are a noble-minded woman, and it was your grief that disarmed me. Still, I was but an agent, led on by an invisible and offended deity, who chose not to withhold the fatal blow that I was destined to hurl. I take that God to witness, at whose feet I have prostrated myself daily for the last 10 years, that I would have sacrificed my life to you, and with my life the projects that were indissolubly linked with it. But, and I say it with some pride, Mercedes, God needed me, and I lived. Examine the past and the present, and endeavor to dive into futurity, and then say whether I am not a divine instrument. The most dreadful misfortunes, the most frightful sufferings, the abandonment of all those who loved me, the persecution of those who did not know me, formed the trials of my youth, when suddenly, from captivity, solitude, misery, I was restored to light and liberty, and became the possessor of a fortune so brilliant, so unbounded, so unheard of, that I must have been blind not to be conscious that God had endowed me with it to work out his own great designs. From that time I looked upon this fortune as something confided to me for an especial purpose. Not a thought was given to a life which you once, Mercedes, had the power to render blissful. Not 1 hour of peaceful calm was mine, but I felt myself driven on like an exterminating angel. Like adventurous captains about to embark on some enterprise full of danger, I laid in my provisions, I loaded my weapons, I collected every means of attack and defense. I inured my body to the most violent exercises, my soul to the bitterest trials. I taught my arm to slay, my eyes to behold excruciating sufferings, and my mouth to smile at the most horrid spectacles. Good-natured, confiding, and forgiving as I had been, I became revengeful, cunning, and wicked, or rather, immovable as fate. Then I launched out into the path that was opened to me. I overcame every obstacle and reached the goal. But woe to those who stood in my pathway. "Enough," said Mercedes. "Enough, Edmund. Believe me that she who alone recognized you has been the only one to comprehend you, and had she crossed your path, and you had crushed her like glass, still, Edmund, still she must have admired you. Like the gulf between me and the past, there is an abyss between you, Edmund, and the rest of mankind. And I tell you freely that the comparison I draw between you and other men will ever be one of my greatest tortures. No, there is nothing in the world to resemble you in worth and goodness. But we must say farewell, Edmund, and let us part." "Before I leave you, Mercedes, have you no request to make?" said the Count. "I desire but one thing in this world, Edmund, the happiness of my son. Pray to the Almighty to spare his life, and I will take upon myself to promote his happiness." "Thank you, Edmund." "But have you no request to make for yourself, Mercedes?" "For myself I want nothing. I live, as it were, between two graves. One is that of Edmond Dantes, lost to me long, long since. He had my love. That word ill becomes my faded lip now, but it is a memory dear to my heart, and one that I would not lose for all that the world contains. The other grave is that of the man who met his death from the hand of Edmond Dantes. I approve of the deed, but I must pray for the dead." "Your son shall be happy, Mercedes," repeated the Count. "Then I shall enjoy as much happiness as this world can possibly confer." "But what are your intentions?" "To say that I shall live here like the Mercedes of other times, gaining my bread by labor, would not be true, nor would you believe me. I have no longer the strength to do anything but to spend my days in prayer. However, I shall have no occasion to work, for the little sum of money buried by you, and which I found in the place you mentioned, will be sufficient to maintain me. Rumor will probably be busy respecting me, my occupations, my manner of living. That will signify but little." "Mercedes," said the Count, "I do not say it to blame you, but you made an unnecessary sacrifice in the relinquishing of the whole of the fortune amassed by Monsieur de Morcerf. Half of it, at least by right, belonged to you, in virtue of your vigilance and economy. I perceive what you are intending to propose to me, but I cannot accept it, Edmund. My son would not permit it. Nothing shall be done without the full approbation of Albert de Morcerf. I will make myself acquainted with his intentions and will submit to them. But if he be willing to accept my offers, will you oppose them? You well know, Edmund, that I am no longer a reasoning creature. I have no will, unless it be the will never to decide. I have been so overwhelmed by the many storms that have broken over my head that I am become passive in the hands of the Almighty, like a sparrow in the talons of an eagle. I live because it is not ordained for me to die. If succor be sent to me, I will accept it. Ah, madame, said Monte Cristo, you should not talk thus. It is not so we should evince our resignation to the will of heaven. On the contrary, we are all free agents. Alas, exclaimed Mercedes, if it were so, if I possessed free will, but without the power to render that will efficacious, it would drive me to despair. Monte Cristo dropped his head and shrank from the vehemence of her grief. Will you not even say you will see me again? He asked. On the contrary, we shall meet again, said Mercedes, pointing to heaven with solemnity. I tell you so to prove to you that I still hope. And after pressing her own trembling hand upon that of the Count, Mercedes rushed up the stairs and disappeared. Monte Cristo slowly left the house and turned towards the quay, but Mercedes did not witness his departure, although she was seated at the little window of the room which had been occupied by old Dantes. Her eyes were straining to see the ship which was carrying her son over the vast sea, but still her voice involuntarily murmured softly, "Edmund, Edmund, Edmund."
An acquaintance of mine once told me the following story. When I was a student at Moscow, I happened to live alongside one of those ladies whose repute is questionable. She was a Pole, and they called her Teresa. She was a tallish, powerfully built brunette, with black, bushy eyebrows, and a large, coarse face, as if carved out by a hatchet. The bestial gleam of her dark eyes, her thick bass voice, her cabman-like gait, and her immense muscular vigor, worthy of a fishwife, inspired me with horror. I lived on the top flight, and her garret was opposite to mine. I never left my door open when I knew her to be at home, but this, after all, was a very rare occurrence. Sometimes I chanced to meet her on the staircase or in the yard, and she would smile upon me with a smile which seemed to me to be sly and cynical. Occasionally I saw her drunk, with bleary eyes, tousled hair, and a particularly hideous grin. On such occasions she would speak to me. "How do you do, Mr. Student?" And her stupid laugh would still further intensify my loathing of her. I should have liked to have changed my quarters in order to have avoided such encounters and greetings, but my little chamber was a nice one, and there was such a wide view from the window, and it was always so quiet in the street below. So I endured. And one morning I was sprawling on my couch, trying to find some sort of excuse for not attending my class, when the door opened, and the bass voice of Teresa the Loathsome resounded from my threshold. "Good health to you, Mr. Student." "What do you want?" I said. I saw that her face was confused and supplicatory. It was a very unusual sort of face for her. "Sir, I want to beg a favor of you. Will you grant it me?" I lay there silent and thought to myself, "Gracious! Courage, my boy." I want to send a letter home, that's what it is, she said. Her voice was beseeching, soft, timid. Deuce take you, I thought. But up I jumped, sat down at my table, took a sheet of paper, and said, "Come here, sit down and dictate." She came, sat down very gingerly on a chair, and looked at me with a guilty look. "Well, to whom do you want to write?" "To Boleslav Kashput, at the town of Sviptiana, on the Warsaw Road." "Well, fire away." "My dear Boles, my darling, my faithful lover, may the Mother of God protect thee. Thou heart of gold, why hast thou not written for such a long time to thy sorrowing little dove Teresa?" I very nearly burst out laughing. A sorrowing little dove, more than 5 feet high, with fists a stone and more in weight, and as black a face as if the little dove had lived all its life in a chimney, and had never once washed itself. Restraining myself somehow, I asked, "Who is this Bolest?" "Boles, Mr. Student," she said, as if offended with me for blundering over the name. "He is Boles, my young man." "Young man?" "Why are you so surprised, sir? Cannot I, a girl, have a young man?" She a girl? Well. "Oh, why not?" I said. "All things are possible. And has he been your young man long?" 6 years. "Oh," I thought. "Well, let us write your letter." And I tell you plainly that I would willingly have changed places with this Bolus if his fair correspondent had been not Teresa, but something less than she. "I thank you most heartily, sir, for your kind services," said Teresa to me with a curtsy. "Perhaps I can show you some service, eh?" "No, I most humbly thank you all the same." "Perhaps, sir, your shirts or your trousers may want a little mending?" I felt that this mastodon in petticoats had made me grow quite red with shame, and I told her pretty sharply that I had no need whatever of her services. She departed. A week or two passed away. It was evening. I was sitting at my window whistling, and thinking of some expedient for enabling me to get away from myself. I was bored. The weather was dirty. I didn't want to go out, and out of sheer ennui I began a course of self-analysis and reflection. This also was dull enough work, but I didn't care about doing anything else. Then the door opened. Heaven be praised, someone came in. "Oh, Mr. Student, you have no pressing business, I hope?" It was Teresa. Humph. "No, what is it?" "I was going to ask you, sir, to write me another letter." "Very well. To Bolus, eh?" "No, this time it is from him." "What?" "Stupid that I am. It is not for me, Mr. Student, I beg your pardon. It is for a friend of mine, that is to say, not a friend, but an acquaintance, a man acquaintance. He has a sweetheart just like me here, Teresa. That's how it is. Will you, sir, write a letter to this Teresa?" I looked at her. Her face was troubled. Her fingers were trembling. I was a bit fogged at first, and then I guessed how it was. "Look here, my lady," I said. "There are no Boluses or Teresas at all, and you've been telling me a pack of lies. Don't you come sneaking about me any longer. I have no wish whatever to cultivate your acquaintance. Do you understand?" And suddenly she grew strangely terrified and distraught. She began to shift from foot to foot without moving from the place, and spluttered comically, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't. I waited to see what would come of all this, and I saw and felt that apparently I had made a great mistake in suspecting her of wishing to draw me from the path of righteousness. It was evidently something very different. "Mr. Student," she began, and suddenly, waving her hand, she turned abruptly towards the door and went out. I remained with a very unpleasant feeling in my mind. I listened. Her door was flung violently to. Plainly the poor wench was very angry. I thought it over, and resolved to go to her, and, inviting her to come in here, write everything she wanted. I entered her apartment. I looked round. She was sitting at the table, leaning on her elbows, with her head in her hands. "Listen to me," I said. Now, whenever I come to this point in my story, I always feel horribly awkward and idiotic. Well. "Listen to me," I said. She leaped from her seat, came towards me with flashing eyes, and laying her hands on my shoulders began to whisper, or rather to hum in her peculiar bass voice. "Look you now, it's like this. There's no Bolus at all, and there's no Teresa either. But what's that to you? Is it a hard thing for you to draw your pen over paper, huh? Ah, and you, too, still such a little fair-haired boy. There's nobody at all, neither Bolus nor Teresa, only me. There you have it, and much good may it do you." "Pardon me," said I, altogether flabbergasted by such a reception. "What is it all about? There's no Bolus, you say?" "No, so it is." "And no Teresa either?" "And no Teresa. I'm Teresa." I didn't understand it at all. I fixed my eyes upon her, and tried to make out which of us was taking leave of his or her senses. But she went again to the table, searched about for something, came back to me, and said in an offended tone, "If it was so hard for you to write to Bolus, look, there's your letter. Take it. Others will write for me." I looked. In her hand was my letter to Bolus. Phew! "Listen, Teresa, what is the meaning of all this? Why must you get others to write for you when I have already written it and you haven't sent it?" "Sent it? Where?" "Why, to this Bolus." "There's no such person." I absolutely did not understand it. There was nothing for me but to spit and go. Then she explained. "What is it?" she said, still offended. "There's no such person, I tell you." And she extended her arms as if she herself did not understand why there should be no such person. "But I wanted him to be... Am I then not a human creature like the rest of them? Yes, I know, of course. Yet no harm was done to anyone by my writing to him that I can see." "Pardon me, to whom?" "To Bolus, of course." "But he doesn't exist." Alas. But what if he doesn't? He doesn't exist. But he might. I write to him, and it looks as if he did exist. And Teresa, that's me, and he replies to me, and then I write to him again." I understood at last, and I felt so sick, so miserable, so ashamed somehow. Alongside of me, not 3 yards away, lived a human creature who had nobody in the world to treat her kindly, affectionately, and this human being had invented a friend for herself. "Look now, you wrote me a letter to Bolus, and I gave it to someone else to read it to me. And when they read it to me, I listened and fancied that Bolus was there. And I asked you to write me a letter from Bolus to Teresa, that is to me. When they write such a letter for me and read it to me, I feel quite sure that Bolus is there, and life grows easier for me in consequence." "Deuce take you for a blockhead," said I to myself when I heard this. And from thenceforth, regularly, twice a week, I wrote a letter to Bolus, and an answer from Bolus to Teresa. I wrote those answers well. She, of course, listened to them and wept like anything, roared, I should say, with her bass voice, and in return for my thus moving her to tears by real letters from the imaginary Bolus, she began to mend the holes I had in my socks, shirts, and other articles of clothing. Subsequently, about 3 months after this history began, they put her in prison for something or other. No doubt by this time she is dead. My acquaintance shook the ash from his cigarette, looked pensively up at the sky, and thus concluded, "Well, well, the more a human creature has tasted of bitter things, the more it hungers after the sweet things of life, and we, wrapped round in the rags of our virtues, and regarding others through the mist of our self-sufficiency, and persuaded of our universal impeccability, do not understand this. And the whole thing turns out pretty stupidly, and very cruelly. The fallen classes, we say. And who are the fallen classes, I should like to know? They are, first of all, people with the same bones, flesh and blood and nerves as ourselves. We have been told this day after day for ages, and we actually listen, and the devil only knows how hideous the whole thing is. Or are we completely depraved by the loud sermonizing of humanism? In reality, we also are fallen folks, and so far as I can see, very deeply fallen into the abyss of self-sufficiency and the conviction of our own superiority. But enough of this. It is all as old as the hills, so old that it is a shame to speak of it. Very old indeed. Yes, that's what it is.
A severe and serious voice. "And here is the money." Young Gillian touched the thin package of $50 bills and laughed. "It's such an unusual amount," he explained kindly to the lawyer. "If it had been 10,000, a man might celebrate with a lot of fireworks. Even $50 would have been less trouble." "You heard the reading of your uncle's will after he died," continued the lawyer Tolman. "I do not know if you paid much attention to its details. I must remind you of one. You are required to provide us with a report of how you use this $1,000 as soon as you have spent it. I trust that you will obey the wishes of your late uncle." "You may depend on it," said the young man respectfully. Gillian went to his club. He searched for a man he called Old Bryson. Old Bryson was a calm, antisocial man about 40 years old. He was in a corner reading a book. When he saw Gillian coming near, he took a noisy, deep breath, laid down his book, and took off his glasses. "I have a funny story to tell you," said Gillian. "I wish you would tell it to someone in the billiard room," said old Bryson. "You know how I hate your stories." "This is a better one than usual," said Gillian, rolling a cigarette, "and I'm glad to tell it to you. It's too sad and funny to go with the rattling of billiard balls. I've just come from a meeting with my late uncle's lawyers. He leaves me an even $1,000. Now, what can a man possibly do with $1,000? Old Bryson showed very little interest. "I thought the late Septimus Gillian was worth something like $500,000. "He was," agreed Gillian happily, "and that's where the joke comes in. He has left a lot of his money to an organism. That is, part of it goes to the man who invents a new bacillus, and the rest to establish a hospital for doing away with it again. There are one or two small, unimportant gifts on the side. The butler and the housekeeper get a seal ring and $10 each. His nephew gets $1,000. "Were there any others mentioned in your uncle's will?" asked old Bryson. "None," said Gillian. "Well, there is a Miss Hayden. My uncle was responsible for her. She lived in his house. She's a quiet thing, musical, the daughter of somebody who was unlucky enough to be his friend. I forgot to say that she was in on the ring and $10 joke, too. I wish I had been. Then I could have had 2 bottles of wine, given the ring to the waiter, and had the whole business off my hands. Now tell me what a man can do with $1,000. Old Bryson rubbed his glasses and smiled. And when old Bryson smiled, Gillian knew that he intended to be more offensive than ever. "There are many good things a man could do with $1,000, said Bryson. "You?" he said with a gentle laugh. "Why, Bobby Gillian, there's only one reasonable thing you could do. You can go and buy Miss Lotta Lauriere a diamond necklace with the money, and then take yourself off to Idaho and inflict your presence upon a ranch. I advise a sheep ranch, as I have a particular dislike for sheep." "Thanks," said Gillian, as he rose from his chair. "I knew I could depend on you, old Bryson. You've hit on the very idea. I wanted to spend the money on one thing, because I have to turn in a report for it, and I hate itemizing." Gillian phoned for a cab and said to the driver, "The stage entrance of the Columbine Theater." The theater was crowded. Miss Lotta Lauriere was preparing for her performance when her assistant spoke the name of Mr. Gillian. "Let it in," said Miss Lauriere. "Now, what is it, Bobby? I'm going on stage in 2 minutes. "It won't take 2 minutes for me. What do you say to a little thing in the jewelry line? I can spend $1,000. "Say, Bobby," said Miss Lauriere, "did you see that necklace Della Stacy had on the other night? It cost $2,200 at Tiffany's." Miss Lauriere was called to the stage for her performance. Gillian slowly walked out to where his cab was waiting. "What would you do with $1,000 if you had it?" he asked the driver. "Open a drinking place," said the driver quickly. "I know a place I could take money in with both hands. I've got it worked out, if you were thinking of putting up the money." "Oh, no," said Gillian. "I was just wondering." 8 blocks down Broadway, Gillian got out of the cab. A blind man sat on the sidewalk selling pencils. Gillian went out and stood in front of him. "Excuse me, But would you mind telling me what you would do if you had $1,000? Asked Gillian. The blind man took a small book from his coat pocket and held it out. Gillian opened it and saw that it was a bank deposit book. It showed that the blind man had a balance of $1,785 in his bank account. Gillian returned the bank book and got back into the cab. "I forgot something," he said. "You may drive to the law offices of Tolman and Sharp." Lawyer Tolman looked at Gillian in a hostile and questioning way. "I beg your pardon," said Gillian cheerfully, "but was Miss Hayden left anything by my uncle's will in addition to the ring and the $10? "Nothing," said Mr. Tolman. "I thank you very much, sir," said Gillian, and went to his cab. He gave the driver the address of his late uncle's home. Miss Hayden was writing letters in the library. The small, thin woman wore black clothes, but you would have noticed her eyes. Gillian entered the room as if the world were unimportant. "I have just come from old Tolman's," he explained. "They have been going over the papers down there. They found Gillian searched his memory for a legal term. "They found an amendment or a postscript or something to the will. It seemed that my uncle had second thoughts and willed you $1,000. Tolman asked me to bring you the money. Here it is." Gillian laid the money beside her hand on the desk. Miss Hayden turned white. "Oh," she said, and again, "Oh." Gillian half turned and looked out the window. In a low voice he said, "I suppose, of course, that you know I love you." "I am sorry," said Miss Hayden as she picked up her money. "There is no use?" asked Gillian, almost light-heartedly. "I am sorry," she said again. "May I write a note?" asked Gillian with a smile. Miss Hayden supplied him with paper and pen, and then went back to her writing table. Gillian wrote a report of how he spent the $1,000. Paid by Robert Gillian $1,000 on account of the eternal happiness owed by heaven to the best and dearest woman on earth. Gillian put the note into an envelope. He bowed to Miss Hayden and left. His cab stopped again at the offices of Tolman and Sharp. "I have spent the $1,000, he said cheerfully to Tolman, "and I have come to present a report of it as I agreed." He threw a white envelope on the lawyer's table. Without touching the envelope, Mr. Tolman went to a door and called his partner, Sharp. Together, they searched for something in a large safe. They brought out a big envelope sealed with wax. As they opened the envelope, they shook their heads together over its contents. Then Tolman became the spokesman. "Mr. Gillian," he said, "there was an addition to your uncle's will. It was given to us privately, with instructions that it not be opened until you had provided us with a full report of your handling of the $1,000 received in the will. As you have satisfied the conditions, my partner and I have read the addition. I will explain to you the spirit of its contents. In the event that your use of the $1,000 shows that you possess any of the qualifications that deserve reward, you stand to gain much more. If your disposal of the money in question has been sensible, wise, or unselfish, it is in our power to give you bonds to the value of $50,000. But if you have used this money in a wasteful, foolish way, as you have in the past, the $50,000 is to be paid to Miriam Hayton, ward of the late Mr. Gillian, without delay. Now, Mr. Gillian, Mr. Sharp and I will examine your report of the $1,000. Mr. Tolman reached for the envelope. Gillian was a little quicker in taking it up. He calmly tore the report and its cover into pieces and dropped them into his pocket. "It's all right," he said smilingly. "There isn't a bit of need to bother you with this. I don't suppose you would understand these itemized bets anyway. I lost the $1,000 on the races. Good day to you, gentlemen." Tolman and Sharp shook their heads mournfully at each other when Gillian left. They heard him whistling happily in the hallway as he waited for the elevator.
When the caleche stopped, the driver jumped down and held out his hand to assist me to alight. Again, I could not but notice his prodigious strength. His hand actually seemed like a steel vice that could have crushed mine if he had chosen. Then he took my traps and placed them on the ground beside me as I stood close to a great door, old and studded with large iron nails, and set in a projecting doorway of massive stone. I could see, even in the dim light, that the stone was massively carved, but that the carving had been much worn by time and weather. As I stood, the driver jumped again into his seat and shook the reins. The horses started forward, and trap and all disappeared down one of the dark openings. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Of bell or knocker there was no sign. Through these frowning walls and dark window openings it was not likely that my voice could penetrate. The time I waited seemed endless, and I felt doubts and fears crowding upon me. What sort of place had I come to, and among what kind of people? What sort of grim adventure was it on which I had embarked? Was this a customary incident in the life of a solicitor's clerk sent out to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner? Solicitor's clerk. Mina would not like that. Solicitor. For just before leaving London I got word that my examination was successful, and I am now a full-blown solicitor. I began to rub my eyes and pinch myself to see if I were awake. It all seemed like a horrible nightmare to me, and I expected that I should suddenly awake and find myself at home, with the dawn struggling in through the windows, as I had now and again felt in the morning after a day of overwork. But my flesh answered the pinching test, and my eyes were not to be deceived. I was indeed awake and among the Carpathians. All I could do now was to be patient, and to wait the coming of morning. Just as I had come to this conclusion, I heard a heavy step approaching behind the great door, and saw through the chinks the gleam of a coming light. Then there was the sound of rattling chains and the clanking of massive bolts drawn back. A key was turned with the loud, grating noise of long disuse, and the great door swung back. Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven save for a long white mustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of color about him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp, in which the flame burned without a chimney or globe of any kind, throwing long, quivering shadows as it flickered in the draught of the open door. The old man motioned me in with his right hand with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own free will." He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. Again he said, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." The strength of the handshake was so much akin to that which I had noticed in the driver, whose face I had not seen, that for a moment I doubted if it were not the same person to whom I was speaking. So, to make sure, I said interrogatively, "Count Dracula?" He bowed in a courtly way as he replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." As he was speaking, he put the lamp on a bracket on the wall and, stepping out, took my luggage. He had carried it in before I could forestall him. I protested, but he insisted. "Nay, sir, you are my guest. It is late, and my people are not available. Let me see to your comfort myself." He insisted on carrying my traps along the passage, and then up a great winding stair, and along another great passage, on whose stone floor our steps rang heavily. At the end of this he threw open a heavy door, and I rejoiced to see within a well-lit room in which a table was spread for supper, and on whose mighty hearth a great fire of logs, freshly replenished, flamed and flared. The Count halted, putting down my bags, closed the door, and, crossing the room, opened another door which led into a small octagonal room lit by a single lamp, and seemingly without a window of any sort. Passing through this, he opened another door, and motioned me to enter. It was a welcome sight, for here was a great bedroom, well lighted and warmed with another log fire, also added to but lately, for the top logs were fresh, which sent a hollow roar up the wide chimney. The Count himself left my luggage inside and withdrew, saying before he closed the door, "You will need, after your journey, to refresh yourself by making your toilet. I trust you will find all you wish. When you are ready, come into the other room, where you will find your supper prepared." The light and warmth and the Count's courteous welcome seemed to have dissipated all my doubts and fears. Having then reached my normal state, I discovered that I was half famished with hunger, so making a hasty toilet, I went into the other room. I found supper already laid out. My host, who stood on one side of the great fireplace, leaning against the stonework, made a graceful wave of his hand to the table and said, "I pray you be seated and sup how you please. You will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you, but I have dined already, and I do not sup." I handed him the sealed letter which Mr. Hawkins had entrusted to me. He opened it and read it gravely. Then, with a charming smile, he handed it to me to read. One passage of it, at least, gave me a thrill of pleasure. "I must regret that an attack of gout, from which malady I am a constant sufferer, forbids me absolutely any traveling on my part for some time to come. But I am happy to say I can send a sufficient substitute, one in whom I have every possible confidence. He is a young man full of energy and talent in his own way, and of a very faithful disposition. He is discreet and silent, and has grown into manhood in my service. He shall be ready to attend on you when you will during his stay, and shall take your instructions in all matters." The Count himself came forward and took off the cover of a dish, and I fell to at once on an excellent roast chicken. This, with some cheese and a salad and a bottle of old Tokay, of which I had 2 glasses, was my supper. During the time I was eating it, the Count asked me many questions as to my journey, and I told him by degrees all I had experienced. By this time I had finished my supper, and by my host's desire had drawn up a chair by the fire and begun to smoke a cigar which he offered me, at the same time excusing himself that he did not smoke. I had now an opportunity of observing him, and found him of a very marked physiognomy. His face was a very strong aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead, and hair growing scantily round the temples, but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. Hitherto I had noticed the backs of his hands as they lay on his knees in the firelight, and they had seemed rather white and fine. But seeing them now close to me, I could not but notice that they were rather coarse, broad, with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the center of the palm. The nails were long and fine and cut to a sharp point. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me which, do what I would, I could not conceal. The Count, evidently noticing it, drew back, and with a grim sort of smile which showed more than he had yet done of his protuberant teeth, sat himself down again on his own side of the fireplace. We were both silent for a while, and as I looked towards the window I saw the first dim streak of the coming dawn. There seemed a strange stillness over everything. But as I listened, I heard, as if from down below in the valley, the howling of many wolves. The Count's eyes gleamed, and he said, "Listen to them, the children of the night. What music they make!" Seeing, I suppose, some expression in my face strange to him, he added, "Ah, sir, you dwellers in the city cannot enter into the feelings of the hunter." Then he rose and said, "But you must be tired. Your bedroom is all ready, and tomorrow you shall sleep as late as you will. I have to be away till the afternoon, so sleep well, and dream well." With a courteous bow, he opened for me himself the door to the octagonal room, and I entered my bedroom. I am all in a sea of wonders. I doubt, I fear, I think strange things which I dare not confess to my own soul. God keep me, if only for the sake of those dear to me.
For several days after our memorable halt, the slopes became more rapid. Some were even of a most frightful character, almost vertical, so that we were forever going down into the solid interior mass. During some days we actually descended 1.5 leagues, even 2 leagues towards the center of the earth. The descents were sufficiently perilous, and while we were engaged in them, we learned fully to appreciate the marvelous coolness of our guide, Hans. Without him we should have been wholly lost. The grave and impassible Icelander devoted himself to us with the most incomprehensible sang-froid and ease, and, thanks to him, many a dangerous pass was got over, where, but for him, we should inevitably have stuck fast. His silence increased every day. I think that we began to be influenced by this peculiar trait in his character. It is certain that the inanimate objects by which you are surrounded have a direct action on the brain. It must be that a man who shuts himself up between 4 walls must lose the faculty of associating ideas and words. How many persons condemned to the horrors of solitary confinement have gone mad, simply because the thinking faculties have lain dormant? During the 2 weeks that followed our last interesting conversation, there occurred nothing worthy of being especially recorded. I have, while writing these memoirs, taxed my memory in vain for one incident of travel during this particular period. But the next event to be related is terrible indeed. Its very memory, even now, makes my soul shudder, and my blood run cold. It was on the 7th of August. Our constant and successive descents had taken us quite 30 leagues into the interior of the earth. That is to say that there were above us 30 leagues, nearly 100 miles of rocks and oceans and continents and towns, to say nothing of living inhabitants. We were in a southeasterly direction, about 200 leagues from Iceland. On that memorable day, the tunnel had begun to assume an almost horizontal course. I was, on this occasion, walking on in front. My uncle had charge of one of the Ruhmkorff coils. I had possession of the other. By means of its light, I was busy examining the different layers of granite. I was completely absorbed in my work. Suddenly halting and turning round, I found that I was alone. Well, thought I to myself, I have certainly been walking too fast, or else Hans and my uncle have stopped to rest. The best thing I can do is go back and find them. Luckily, there is very little ascent to tire me. I accordingly retraced my steps, and, while doing so, walked for at least a quarter of an hour. Rather uneasy, I paused and looked eagerly around. Not a living soul. I called aloud. No reply. My voice was lost amid the myriad cavernous echoes it aroused. I began, for the first time, to feel seriously uneasy. A cold shiver shook my whole body, and perspiration, chill and terrible, burst upon my skin. I must be calm, I said, speaking aloud, as boys whistle to drive away fear. There can be no doubt that I shall find my companions. There cannot be two roads. It is certain that I was considerably ahead. All I have to do is to go back. Having come to this determination, I ascended the tunnel for at least half an hour, unable to decide if I had ever seen certain landmarks before. Every now and then I paused to discover if any loud appeal was made to me, well knowing that in that dense and intensified atmosphere I should hear it a long way off. But no. The most extraordinary silence reigned in this immense gallery. Only the echoes of my own footsteps could be heard. At last I stopped. I could scarcely realize the fact of my isolation. I was quite willing to think that I had made a mistake, but not that I was lost. If I had made a mistake, I might find my way. If lost, I shuddered to think of it. Come, I said to myself. Since there is only one road, and they must come by it, we shall at last meet. All I have to do is still go upwards. Perhaps, however, not seeing me and forgetting I was ahead, they may have gone back in search of me. Still, even in this case, if I make haste, I shall get up to them. There can be no doubt about the matter. But as I spoke these last words aloud, it would have been quite clear to any listener, had there been one, that I was by no means convinced of the fact. Moreover, in order to associate together these simple ideas, and to reunite them under the form of reasoning, required some time. I could not all at once bring my brain to think. Then another dread doubt fell upon my soul. After all, was I ahead? Of course I was. Hans was no doubt following behind, preceded by my uncle. I perfectly recollected his having stopped for a moment to strap his baggage on his shoulder. I now remember this trifling detail. It was, I believe, just at that very moment that I had determined to continue my route. Again, thought I, reasoning as calmly as was possible, there is another sure means of not losing my way. A thread to guide me through the labyrinthine subterraneous retreat. One which I had forgotten. My faithful river. This course of reasoning roused my drooping spirits, and I resolved to resume my journey without further delay. No time was to be lost. It was at this moment that I had reason to bless the thoughtfulness of my uncle, when he refused to allow the eider hunter to close the orifices of the hot spring, that small fissure in the great mass of granite. This beneficent spring, after having saved us from thirst during so many days, would now enable me to regain the right road. Having come to this mental decision, I made up my mind, before I started upwards, that ablution would certainly do me a great deal of good. I stopped to plunge my hands and forehead in the pleasant water of the Hansbach stream, blessing its presence as a certain consolation. Conceive my horror and stupefaction. I was treading a hard, dusty, shingly road of granite. The stream on which I reckoned had wholly disappeared. No words in any human language can depict my utter despair. I was literally buried alive, with no other expectation before me but to die in all the slow, horrible torture of hunger and thirst. Mechanically I crawled about, feeling the dry, arid rock. Never to my fancy had I ever felt anything so dry. But, I frantically asked myself, how had I lost the course of the flowing stream? There could be no doubt it had ceased to flow in the gallery in which I now was. Now I began to understand the cause of the strange silence which prevailed when last I tried if any appeal from my companions might perchance reach my ear. It so happened that when I first took an imprudent step in the wrong direction, I did not perceive the absence of the all-important stream. It was now quite evident that when we halted, another tunnel must have received the waters of the little torrent, and that I had unconsciously entered a different gallery. To what unknown depths had my companions gone? Where was I? How to get back? Clue or landmark there was absolutely none. My feet left no signs on the granite and shingle. My brain throbbed with agony as I tried to discover the solution of this terrible problem. My situation, after all sophistry and reflection, had finally to be summed up in 3 awful words. Lost. 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 Lost at a depth which, to my finite understanding, appeared to be immeasurable. These 30 leagues of the crust of the earth weighed upon my shoulders, like the globe on the shoulders of Atlas. I felt myself crushed by the awful weight. It was indeed a position to drive the sanest man to madness. I tried to bring my thoughts back to the things of the world so long forgotten. It was with the greatest difficulty that I succeeded in doing so. Hamburg, the house on the Königstrasse, my dear cousin Gretchen, all that world which had before vanished like a shadow, floated before my now vivid imagination. There they were before me, but how unreal. Under the influence of a terrible hallucination, I saw all the incidents of our journey pass before me like the scenes of a panorama. The ship and its inmates, Iceland, M. Friedrichsen, and the great summit of Mount Sneffels. I said to myself that, if in my position I retained the most faint and shadowy outline of a hope, it would be a sure sign of approaching delirium. It were better to give way wholly to despair. In fact, did I but reason with calmness and philosophy, what human power was there in existence able to take me back to the surface of the earth, and ready, too, to split asunder, to rend in twain those huge and mighty vaults which stand above my head? Who could enable me to find my road, and regain my companions? Insensate folly and madness to entertain even a shadow of hope. "Oh, uncle," was my despairing cry. This was the only word of reproach which came to my lips, for I thoroughly understood how deeply and sorrowfully the worthy professor would regret my loss, and how in his turn he would patiently seek for me. When I at last began to resign myself to the fact that no further aid was to be expected from man, and knowing that I was utterly powerless to do anything for my own salvation, I kneeled with earnest fervor and asked assistance from heaven. The remembrance of my innocent childhood, the memory of my mother, known only in my infancy, came welling forth from my heart. I had recourse to prayer, and little as I had a right to be remembered by him whom I had forgotten in the hour of prosperity, and whom I so tardily invoked, I prayed earnestly and sincerely. This renewal of my youthful faith brought about a much greater amount of calm, and I was enabled to concentrate all my strength and intelligence on the terrible realities of my unprecedented situation. I had about me that which I had first wholly forgotten, 3 days' provisions. Moreover, my water bottle was quite full. Nevertheless, the one thing which it was impossible to do was to remain alone. Try to find my companions I must, at any price. But which course should I take? Should I go upwards, or again descend? Doubtless it was right to retrace my steps in an upward direction. By doing this with care and coolness, I must reach the point where I had turned away from the rippling stream. I must find the fatal bifurcation or fork. Once at this spot, once the river at my feet, I could, at all events, regain the awful crater of Mount Sneffels. Why had I not thought of this before? This, at last, was a reasonable hope of safety. The most important thing, then, to be done was to discover the bed of the Hansbach. After a slight meal and a draught of water, I rose like a giant refreshed. Leaning heavily on my pole, I began the ascent of the gallery. The slope was very rapid and rather difficult, but I advanced hopefully and carefully, like a man who at last is making his way out of a forest and knows there is only one road to follow. During 1 whole hour nothing happened to check my progress. As I advanced, I tried to recollect the shape of the tunnel, to recall to my memory certain projections of rocks, to persuade myself that I had followed certain winding routes before. But no one particular sign could I bring to mind, and I was soon forced to allow that this gallery would never take me back to the point at which I had separated myself from my companions. It was absolutely without issue, a mere blind alley in the earth. The moment at length came when, facing the solid rock, I knew my fate, and fell inanimate on the arid floor. To describe the horrible state of despair and fear into which I then fell would now be vain and impossible. My last hope, the courage which had sustained me, drooped before the sight of this pitiless granite rock. Lost in a vast labyrinth, the sinuosities of which spread in every direction, without guide, clue, or compass, I knew it was a vain and useless task to attempt flight. All that remained to me was to lie down and die, the most cruel and horrible of deaths. In my state of mind, the idea came into my head that one day, perhaps, when my fossil bones were discovered, their discovery so far below the level of the earth might give rise to solemn and interesting scientific discussions. I tried to cry aloud, but hoarse, hollow, and inarticulate sounds alone could make themselves heard through my parched lips. I literally panted for breath. In the midst of all these horrible sources of anguish and despair, a new horror took possession of my soul. My lamp, by falling down, had got out of order. I had no means of repairing it. Its light was already becoming paler, and soon would expire. With a strange sense of resignation and despair, I watched the luminous current in the coil getting less and less. A procession of shadows moved, flashing along the granite wall. I scarcely dared to lower my eyelids, fearing to lose the last spark of this fugitive light. Every instant it seemed to me that it was about to vanish, and to leave me forever in utter darkness. At last one final trembling flame remained in the lamp. I followed it with all my power of vision. I gasped for breath. I concentrated upon it all the power of my soul, as upon the last scintillation of light I was ever destined to see. And then I was to be lost forever in Cimmerian and tenebrous shades. A wild and plaintive cry escaped my lips. On Earth, during the most profound and comparatively complete darkness, light never allows a complete destruction and extinction of its power. Light is so diffuse, so subtle, that it permeates everywhere, and whatever little may remain, the retina of the eye will succeed in finding it. In this place, nothing. The absolute obscurity made me blind in every sense. My head was now wholly lost. I raised my arms, trying the effects of the feeling and getting against the cold stone wall. It was painful in the extreme. Madness must have taken possession of me. I knew not what I did. I began to run, to fly, rushing at haphazard in this inextricable labyrinth, always going downwards, running wildly underneath a terrestrial crust, like an inhabitant of the subterranean furnaces, screaming, roaring, howling, until bruised by the pointed rocks, falling and picking myself up all covered with blood, seeking madly to drink the blood which dripped from my torn features, mad because this blood only trickled over my face, and watched always for this horrid wall which ever presented to me the fearful obstacle against which I could not dash my head. Where was I going? It was impossible to say. I was perfectly ignorant of the matter. Several hours passed in this way. After a long time, having utterly exhausted my strength, I fell, a heavy inert mass, along the side of the tunnel, and lost consciousness.